Hello, seniors. We're going to be working through chapter 18 here. I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible because it is a long chapter. I went ahead and truncated about, yes, Pico, that's true. I went ahead and truncated about half the quotes I had, so I'm trying to get only the most important ones on here. Anyways, we'll jump right in. The first thing we see is a letter, and of course, letters are significant throughout this novel. As far back as chapter 1, when the narrator has the dream of his grandfather opening letter after letter, and I suppose before that, the letter in his briefcase giving him the scholarship to the Black College. We then have Bledsoe's letters that, of course, kind of first destroy and then seem to enable this future that he's moved into in Harlem with the Brotherhood. And then he gets this next letter. And so I'll read it quickly here. Brother, this is advice from a friend who has been watching you closely. Do not go too fast. Keep working for the people, but remember that you are one of us. And do not forget that if you get too big, they will cut you down. You're from the South, and you know that this is a white man's world. So take a friendly advice and go easy so that you can keep on helping the colored people. They do not want you to go too fast and will cut you down if you do. Be smart. A lot going on in here, and I think it in some ways kind of foreshadows and emphasizes the difficult, almost Game of Thrones worthy sense of kind of backstabbing and duplicity and opportunism that we see throughout this chapter. So a lot is going on here, and you'll notice maybe throughout this chapter, Ellison is seemingly obsessed with italicizing his pronouns. So I think pronouns have a lot to do here. You'll notice that there seems to be some level of opposition here. Keep working for the people, kind of a populist statement there. But remember that you are one of us, and do not forget that if you get too big, they will cut you down. So there's this idea of the people. Again, I think this communist ideal in some way of everyone good and equal, but there's still the us and them, or they rather. And yes, that's true. You're very chatty, yeah. So I think trying to understand to a large degree what the difference is, who us is and who them is in this letter is important. The writer says you are from the South, so it seems like the writer is pointing out something that's different about him or herself because they're pointing out that the narrator's from the South. If they were both from the South, that probably wouldn't be necessary to point out. You know that this is a white man's world. It's interesting that the writer doesn't say we know that this is a white man's world, and this will come up a bit later, I think, when we eventually learn the identity of the letter writer. So take a friendly advice and go easy so that you can keep on helping the colored people. Again, kind of a curious phrase, one that, of course, I think makes us uncomfortable today to hear, but one that I think, again, symbolizes that the writer probably does not identify him or herself with the group of quote-unquote colored people. They do not want you to go too fast and will cut you down if you do. The they here is ambiguous. It could be colored people, it could be the white man's world, who else could it be? You know, our guesses are endless, but it could be a lot of things. So this letter will kind of always be in the narrator's memory and mindset for the rest of the novel, but again, important letters here. Moving on, we get one of my favorite kind of little images, I think, of the whole novel, this poster that the narrator was instrumental in putting together for the Brotherhood, a symbolic poster. Ellison kind of throws us a freebie with that one, of a group of heroic figures, an American Indian couple representing the dispossessed past, a blonde brother in overalls, and a leading Irish sister representing the dispossessed present. And brother Todd Clifton and a young white couple, it had been felt unwise simply to show Clifton and the girl surrounded by a group of children of mixed races representing the future, a color photograph of bright skin texture and smooth contrast. So kind of a past, present, future image here. Interestingly, it seems like race is being exploited. And the past, even though so much of the Brotherhood seems to be, white men and black men in it, It focuses on an American Indian couple. I think there's an irony if we even go back to the narrator's office that he's given with the poster of Columbus. It doesn't seem to be a group that has much voice or representation, but either way, they're in the poster here. Another interesting thing is that it seems like, especially for the narrator, and as we'll see in a moment, Brother Tarp, the dispossessed past would be the enslavement of, Africans and then African Americans in the United States or the New World. And so it's interesting that this is not directly given. It seems like, given the identities, given the backgrounds, given even some of the experiences of the men who make up the Brotherhood, the dispossessed past would be one that would be one of racism against black men and women, and even the effects of slavery that still exist today. Either way, it seems to be sidestepped. We have a blonde brother and a leading Irish sister representing the dispossessed present. We have to wonder if maybe there's some opportunism there, that the idea of the Irish, of course, in New York, a group that would be coming to power. One of my sociology professors back in college told me about a book that always sounded really interesting, and unfortunately I only know the general idea. I never read it, but the title was so kind of attention grabbing. I haven't forgot it. It was called How the Irish Became White, and I think, like a lot of this book is taking on, we think of race as simply color. That if a person has light skin, and we would assume that they're white, that they've kind of always been considered white, that it's just a matter of kind of melanin and reflection, and that's not the case. The idea of kind of the Irish or the Eastern Europeans, those were always kind of groups that were marginalized compared to, the Anglos, the British, or the Western Europeans. And so it's probably opportunistic, to use somebody who would be seen as white in this poster, but also somebody who wouldn't kind of be the Anglo, power broker, blue blood there, somebody Irish, somebody who is coming to power, but coming to power through the bottom up in New York at this time. And then finally, Brother Todd Clifton and a young white couple. It had been felt unwise simply to show Clifton and the girl. And clearly the first draft of this poster that showed Clifton and the girl was considered too controversial because Clifton is a black man, albeit an attractive light-skinned black man, but still a black man, and a young white girl seemed kind of too racy in terms of suggesting that there could be miscegenation, which is marriage between races, or something like that. And so it's been revised to kind of make it a little more palatable to broad tastes here. A color photograph of bright skin texture and smooth contrast. What kind of phrase there from Ellison. Smooth contrast, bright skin texture. That there are things that are in opposition here, but the biggest one the poster's trying to get across is skin texture. Not skin color, but skin texture. And again, I think it gets to the complications of race, that it's not just 3 or 4 groups based on the color of your skin. It's many, 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 many different groups within that. And that doesn't mean that those ideas haven't been used, but I think to say, everyone in the world who's black can be recognized by everyone else in the world as black and sees themselves as black and kind of are all on the same team. I think this book is constantly dismantling that and saying that thinking of race as that big of an idea is problematic, even if it has been used as that big of an idea. All right, so, and what I did wasn't much. That is, it wasn't much when I did it, but after all that time, it changed to something else, and it seemed to be as bad as they said it was. All that time made it bad. I paid for it with everything I had but my life. I lost my wife and my boys and my piece of land. So what started out as an argument between a couple of men turned out to be a crime worth 19 years of my life. This is Brother Tarp explaining his placement on a chain gang and why he limps now. First thing I want to jump to is that the idea of 19 years of life here, that's roughly what the narrator is. He's a sophomore in college. He'd be right around 19. I think he states he's 19 or 20 around here. So there seems to be I don't think Ellison's ever picking numbers out of thin air. I think that's relevant, that the amount of time that Tarp was on this chain gang is about the amount of time that the narrator has been alive. But working back from that, Tarp hints at a crime here. I think in some ways, like the vet hinted at what he was kind of marginalized for. What started out as an argument between a couple of men, turned out to be a crime worth 19 years of my life. It's ambiguous. But Tarp says it's not even the crime itself that was bad. Whatever happened in this argument, assault, murder, maybe just talking the wrong way to the wrong person, wasn't the worst part. It was the time that made it bad. And so the amount of time he's dehumanized, the amount of time he's punished, the amount of time he's controlled, made to submit, having his dignity deprived, that's what makes it upsetting. It's not just that something bad happens as a punishment, it's that something bad happens continuously over years or over decades or over generations. Punishment is kind of dealt out for what seems like pretty petty or even manufactured crimes that come up here. So moving on from that, we have Tarp giving the narrator his chain link. I took it in my hand, a thick, dark, oily piece of filed steel that had been twisted open and forced partly back into place, on which I saw marks that might have been made by the blade of a hatchet. It was such a link as I had seen on Bledsoe's desk, only while that one had been smooth, Tarp's bore the marks of haste and violence, looking as though it had been attacked and conquered before it stubbornly yielded. There's this idea of kind of contrasting it with the link on Bledsoe's desk. If you go back to, probably chapter 4 or 5, there is that link on the desk that Bledsoe talks about. But the description here is incredibly interesting because it has a lot of suggestion of, again, a complicated relationship. It was a piece of filed steel that had been twisted open and forced partly back into place. Seems like a really interesting description of the action there. The chain link is twisted open so it can be removed, but then it's partly put back into place. And I think we have to ask, again, how that's symbolic, especially of racism, especially of laws and just general practices of discrimination against black men and women at this time. But we see that Tarp was able to leave this system, at least physically, through violence. The mark might have been made by the blade of a hatchet. Tarp was, hacking at the chain link on his leg. And then we get the contrast with Bledsoe's. And Bledsoe's is smooth. And I think we have to ask why that is. Bledsoe was, in a sense, freed through his submission, but also his intelligence, his ambition, his ruthlessness, I think we could say. All these things made Bledsoe, if not freer than many of the black men and women around him, especially at the college. Tarp has experienced a very different life. Tarp freed, in a sense, himself through violence, and I think he's borne the brunt of that. He's this somewhat forgotten, almost somewhat hidden away brother in the Brotherhood who is telling the story for the very first time to the narrator. So something that he doesn't advertise, but at the same time got his freedom because he took it by force, and he took it subversively. He took it, as a form of transgression or wrongdoing, rather than Bledsoe kind of learning how to argue and be opportunistic to get it. I don't think Ellison is necessarily saying one's better or worse, but he's saying that Bledsoe's seems to be more of an ornament than Tarp's, which is clearly something that showed the violence and pain that he went through. It bore the marks of haste and violence, looking as though it had been attacked and conquered before it stubbornly yielded. But again, I think this is such a in a sense, confusing description, because we go back to the fact that the chain was returned to being a link, forced partly back into place. So a lot going on there. Moving on, we have Brother Restrum and the narrator talking about Tarp's link. Would you care to examine it, brother? One of our members wore it 19 years on the chain gang. Hell no, he recoiled. I mean, no thank you. In fact, brother, I don't think we have to have such things around. That's the worst kind of thing for brotherhood, because we want to make folks think of things we have in common. That's what makes for brotherhood. We have to change this way we have of always talking about how different we are. In the brotherhood. We are all brothers. So we have Restrum, who very much seems, I think, two-faced, and we see that especially by the end of the chapter, where he tries to get the narrator, censured or even kicked out of the brotherhood. But it brings up a very real question about race, and I think this exists in a lot of different forms of, in terms of, the enslavement of Black Americans, and the racism that cropped up around that, whether it's better to kind of look past that and in a sense try to ignore it because it's hurtful to think about, or whether thinking about it and the hurtful nature of it is what's necessary to come to grips with it. So we have the narrator who's keeping it on his desk, this link, this clear physical reminder of enslavement, of racism, of discrimination, of violence, of incarceration, these things that probably still ring true for many people in this nation. And it seems to him that this is something that helps make sense of his past, helps make sense of Blackness, helps make sense of identity, of struggle, of humanity. Restrum says it doesn't. Restrum says that by having the link out on his desk, the narrator's reminding the brotherhood that white men and women have done or supported or been complicit with these actions against Black men and women in this country's past. And he says that it's better to think of the things that we have in common. That's what makes for brotherhood. And again, it's a question that we still fight with today. I know when I was, your guys' age, or probably even a bit younger than you, the idea of color blindness was taken very seriously. And that was the idea of kind of how to heal this country in terms of race. Now I think you guys probably hear that idea and think that sounds almost laughable as kind of a cultural practice to almost deny that race has played a part in our history, or that race still plays a part in our history. So I think we go back and forth, and I think it's probably a discussion we as a nation will have for many, many, many more years, if not decades, maybe forever. But either way, it's expressing these two ideas. Is the way to kind of peace for people, to not bring up the painfulness of the past or the wrongs of the past, or is the way for peace to talk about those things and figure out how, if at all, to work through them and talk about how that hurt felt and how that hurt is still affecting people. Really deep part of the book, and I think again shows how kind of prophetic Ellison is in describing these problems so clearly that we're still kind of grappling with 70 years out. All right. Some call you brother to your face, and the minute you turn your back, you're a black son of a bitch. You gotta watch them. I haven't encountered any of that, brother, I said. You will. There's lots of poison around. Some don't want to shake your hand, and some don't like the idea of seeing too much of you, but goddamn it, in the brotherhood they gotta. I looked at him. It had never occurred to me that the brotherhood could force anyone to shake my hand, and that he found satisfaction. That it could was both shocking and distasteful. Again, Restrum being a very bizarre character. I think he's almost Orwellian in that he can do doublethink. He can say one thing and totally believe it, like everyone should be united, and having chain links out on the desk reminds and people of racism and encourages them to talk about it. But then in this case, clearly feels like race is dominating and race is painful. The idea that to the white people in the Brotherhood, he's just a black son of a bitch. The narrator says he hasn't encountered any of that. And Restrom gives a very, I think, pessimistic "you will." So it's inevitable. There's lots of poison around. Some don't want to shake your hand, and some don't like the idea of seeing too much of you. But God damn it, in the Brotherhood, they gotta. I think also here, the idea of some, he's not saying white people at this point, and I think we see that by the end of it, that for Restrom, the suspicion, the belief in kind of deceit isn't just provided to white people. The narrator, a black man, is a target of Restrom because Restrom sees him as a threat, sees him as somebody disloyal, not just to the Brotherhood, but I think to humanity. And so the narrator here seems to, I think be challenging Restrom's ideas. And for Restrom, the idea of being a part of the Brotherhood, and in a sense maybe evening the playing field by forcing these men who are racist or hold racist ideas. I don't know if there's a difference between those two things. Don't know why I separated it. But anyways, forcing the people who hold racist ideas to interact with you is a victory. The narrator thinks that forcing somebody who hates you to shake your hand is a sense of pleasure that's shocking and distasteful. And again, I think we go back to Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois, the school integration debates in the 60s. If you're walking into a school as a young black man or woman and you're doing it because the National Guard is standing by your side and people have lined up, white people from the cities and towns nearby, to jeer at you, say horrible racist things, threaten your life. I wonder, that must be a complicated experience, to put it very simply. Sure, you're taking a huge step forward, but at the same time, that very visible, open racism has to be painful. And at the same time, I think we look back as a country now on that painful part of our past and say that was what it took in the 60s through integration orders, through busing, through a lot of different things going on, even the presence of the National Guard to protect black men and women who were taking part in integrating schools in these protests. That was what it took to change minds. And of course, I think most of us would say minds still need to be changed, still in this country, but it seems like part of our history is saying that was a necessary part of stepping forward. So in an odd sort of way, the narrator perhaps a little out of sync with Restrom. Restrom would be somebody who said, even if people are against showing you respect or against treating you fairly, that's a victory. That's to be felt as a victory. All right, so we have to learn to trust our other brothers. After all, didn't they start the Brotherhood? Didn't they come and stretch out their hand to us black men and say, we want y'all for our brothers? Didn't they do it? Didn't they now? Didn't they set out to organize us and help fight our battle? Excuse me, all like that. Show they did, and we have to remember it 24 hours a day. Brotherhood. That's the word we got to keep right in front of our eyes every second. So again, Restrom being very complicated, saying the reason we're unified is because the white brothers stood up for us, organized for us, helped fight our battles. So again, drawing this distinction between race and drawing a distinction not just between race, but I think power and ability. The white members of the Brotherhood stretch out their hand to the black men. And I think that this is also reminiscent of W.E.B. Du Bois and the plagiarized speech that the narrator gives way back in chapter 1 about sending down the pail and telling people to kind of save themselves in a community. And it seems very similar to that. And again, I think W.E.B. Du Bois' speech from the Atlanta Compromise was controversial because it seemed to, I think a lot of people felt, overcredit the generosity and the goodness and the humanity of, frankly, groups that had enslaved African Americans. So another interesting point, but I think we see Restrom, if he's not a liar, he's somebody who is incredibly complicated. And I think that that's an important question to ask. Is he just having trouble keeping his story straight? That's how kind of bad a liar and how habitual a liar he is. Or is he somebody who truly can think all these things about race at the same time? And again, begs a good question. Is race one of those things that is too big for one idea or one perspective? Are we always switching between maybe optimistic perspectives on race and identity and the more pessimistic ones depending on the situations that we're in or the experiences that we've had or the identities that we claim? So I think, to write off Restrom as just this inconsistent villain does him a disservice. I think there's more going on there. He struck the conference table with his fist, his eyes showing small and round in his taut face. I wanted to punch that face. It no longer seemed real, but a mask behind which the real face was probably laughing, both at me and at the others, for he couldn't believe what he had said. It just wasn't possible. He was the plotter, and from the serious looks on the committee's faces, he was getting away with it. Again, this idea of masks, we see this with Bledsoe when he's about to walk in to see Dr. Norton, when the narrators brought him back from seeing True Blood, then his experiences at the Golden Day. Dr. Bledsoe is furious with the narrator, angry, and then right before he walks in to see Dr. Norton, the narrator says it's like he's putting on a mask. He becomes calm and sympathetic, and then he opens the door, and then he begs Mr. Norton's forgiveness and understanding of what happened. Again, I think we see that the narrator is saying the idea of identity is complicated, and people wear masks, and I think a question Ellison asks is there ever actually a face behind the mask, or is the mask kind of all we have? We just switch those out, and whichever one we're wearing, that's who we are. There's not anything constant or permanent or deeper than that behind it. So we're forced to think of the organization at the expense of our personal feelings. The Brotherhood is bigger than all of us. None of us as individuals count when its safety is questioned. And be assured that none of us have anything but goodwill toward you. Personally, your work has been splendid. This is simply a matter of the safety of the organization, and it is our responsibility to make a thorough investigation of all such charges. Again, Ellison grappling with individuality versus collectivism, the I versus the we. Brother Jack says, you are expected to sacrifice. We're all expected to sacrifice. None of us as individuals count when its safety is questioned, the safety of the Brotherhood. And again, I think the narrator has constantly been burned by sacrificing his own identity, his own goals, his own humanity for these groups he gets involved in, whether it's the Liberty Paints job, whether it's the college, whether it's the Brotherhood. I think Ellison is very cynical and pessimistic when it comes to the idea of a group or an organization taking care and being able to care about the individual. I think Ellison would say that's always the promise made, and always at some time the organization will break it to save itself. So, I think that's a very dark, negative way of thinking about it. If you're interested in that idea, I'd recommend watching HBO's The Wire. Probably does the best job of making that kind of horrible worldview one that's interesting to watch for 60 hours. But one that I think Ellison is very much identifying with throughout the story. All right, so last one here. Your assignment, should you decide to remain active, Brother Jack said, reaching for his gavel, is to lecture downtown on the woman question. Suddenly I felt as though I had been spun like a top. The what? The woman question. My pamphlet on the woman question in the United States will be your guide. And now, brothers, he said, his eyes sweeping around the table, the meeting is adjourned. This will be something that we'll see for the next couple chapters. You may be asking what the woman question is, and without giving away any spoilers, it's never explained. The most we know about the woman question is that there's a pamphlet called On the Woman Question in the United States. The fact that Brother Jack wrote it, and I think, we identify Brother Jack as a male, speaks to some of the disconnect, maybe some of the talking down, maybe some of, the power imbalance here. But there'll be a lot of discussion of the women question And I think Ellison is kind of very darkly funny in never even making it a question. We never even get that much detail of what the woman question is asking. We just know that there's a woman question, and this will kind of be used to exploit gender, seemingly in the same way race is being exploited in a lot of cases, especially in this chapter. Okay, I will stop there. Have a good one. I will try to crank these out at a rapid pace since we're getting close to the end of the year. So be checking back frequently. Have a good